Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 26th of April, and today's video is really going to be substantial as we're looking at a report from the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, discussing what he claims is the full reconquest of the Kursk and Belgorod regions. So we're going to look at his remarks, and we're going to look at the facts on the ground about what we know about Russia's advances in both of those regions over the past 24 hours, because we definitely do have some recorded advances, not a complete capture of the entire, pre-war boundary, but something that is getting very close to that is now being materialized. So we're going to begin by looking at the Kursk region, and then we'll work our way southwards. And if you guys recall, in yesterday's video, we looked at how the Russians advanced deeper into Sumy, taking over the entirety of this village, Avdiivka, and also this region north of Loknaya. The Ukrainians were actually able to counterattack and reclaim just a certain portion of the northern chunk of that village. So that is marked as such on the map. But over the past 24 hours, we know the Russians have actually gotten closer to Oleshnya. We have the geolocation for that over here, and you could see that marked with this video from April 25th. So we discussed this in yesterday's video, how the 95th Air Assault Brigade targeted incoming Russian motorcycles and vehicles that were approaching that town. Now, in terms of what occurred today, the Russian forces were able to advance into Gornal itself, and in all likelihood took over the entirety of the locality. The 22nd Motor Rifle Regiment, they raised their flag in Gornal. That was from today. You can see the geolocation over here. They've been one of the main units involved in fighting in Guevo, and since then, their infantry have paved the path to enter into Gornal and all of the surrounding regions. So their forces have also been involved in taking over local tree lines and gullies that are very close to the border between Russia and Ukraine. You could see, as a result, they've captured in this region 4.6 square kilometers, in addition to the 1.5 square kilometers that are located within Gornal itself. They also were able to push just south of Guevo, and now the new demarcation line between the Russian and Ukrainian lines of contact, respectively, is basically around the Psel River. The Psel River being this body of water over here that you see is pretty close to the border, but it's a bit north of it. It's actually on Russian territory. You could see that the Russians advanced 1.8 square kilometers, and they're in the process now of also clearing out whatever Ukrainian remnants remain in forested areas, both north and south of the river. And the same thing applies for areas west of Gornal. There are a lot of forested regions that are situated along the border. There are also a lot of trenches that were built by the Russians during the Surovikin era in 2023 that are currently still held by the Ukrainians, although I doubt there are many actual Ukrainian soldiers manning these lines. Nonetheless, there are still recorded Ukrainian troop movements in these areas, all with the hope of just dragging out the fighting and preventing the Russians from approaching the border and then using that as a base to obviously target Ukraine's rear positions in Mohoritsia or Miropilia. Those are the two most notable villages in this region south of Gornal. And so just keep an eye out for these final clearing operations, because the Ukrainians still control roughly 12 square kilometers of territory in Kursk. They control areas that are not populated by any means. And if there wasn't a line that sort of demarcated a border between the Sumy and Kursk regions, then it would just sort of naturally seep into the Ukrainian side of territory and control. But nonetheless, the Russians are also going to make an effort to clear out those regions, including the heavily fortified areas and the areas that are dense in shrubbery and foliage. You can also see that over here with this forested area, with the Russians nearly taking over its entirety. So Deep State, they claim that the claim that was made by the chief of staff, Gerasimov, is an exaggeration, and that Ukrainian forces still operate near the border and also within Oleshnya. So this is a point of contention, because based on the statements by Gerasimov, and he actually submitted a situational report to Putin on this matter, it would heavily imply that the entirety of Oleshnya was taken over by Russian forces. So that's a matter of conflict and can only be resolved once we get some sort of Ukrainian corroboration or geolocations. Another interesting point to note is that Gerasimov did thank forces from North Korea for being involved in the combat operations hand in hand with Russian ground forces. So he was not talking about some sort of ancillary role, anything special. He was talking about actual North Korean infantrymen fighting against Ukrainian soldiers in close quarters combat and involved in the cutting edge of advances, especially during the culmination of some of the fighting in March, when the Russian forces were able to break through the line of contact and seize 19 settlements and really take over a significant chunk of territory within just the span of a couple of days. So, in the build up to that sort of breakthrough that the Russians achieved in March, actually specifically March 6th, there were North Koreans involved, and we'll look specifically at where they were the most involved, because I was mentioning this at the time, if you guys remember. I was mentioning the reports by Russian sources, not Ukrainians, but Russians, that were saying that there were North Korean soldiers involved in fighting in Plechovo, for instance. This is an area that was really involved with North Korean soldiers. Other parts of Kursk didn't have the same amount of North Korean presence, but this is an area where they were seen as useful because it was an area of the front line. When you look at the Kursk region, that was a bit less important. Most of the higher stakes fighting was occurring in areas that are sort of situated around Malaya Luknaya and then also around Zverdlikovo, and then earlier on in the war around Korenovo. So those are areas where you saw less of a North Korean involvement, but then sort of this sort of secondary front where manpower was obviously needed to man the front line to prevent the Ukrainians from going on the offensive. The North Koreans were located there. And then eventually, when the Russians decided that they could exploit gaps in the Ukrainian line and basically reach the Psal River over here, they moved North Korean elements from the organizing point in Giri, as we all know, and they were involved in taking over Plechovo. So North Koreans were a huge part in that. And they were also doing that in tandem with Russian element units like the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade. They were mentioned a lot, including its 11th Battalion. And there are a whole host of other units that were also involved in the fighting over here, including Ahmad's regiments. They also fought in parallel to the North Koreans. And the North Koreans, they basically seldom used armored vehicles, motorcycles, anything of the sort. They were almost exclusively attacking on foot based on footage that we saw from the Ukrainian side. Now, sometimes the Ukrainians may have claimed that there was a large North Korean assault, and perhaps it wasn't just a North Korean assault. Perhaps it was mixed between Russians and North Koreans, and also Russians of East Asian background. And so that's where the sort of muddied waters begin to occur, because we don't know for each specific incident if the Ukrainians were correct. But as a whole, if there was an assault recorded from the Plechovo region, then there's a good chance that it was actually coming from the North Koreans, and they helped push the front line to an area that was located just south of Suja. And that's when the Russian side began to take over more substantially, because at that point, this part of the front line became more significant. And that's when the North Koreans began to sort of reduce their presence over here along the front line. And that occurred in like February or March of 2025. So earlier on, like January 2025, that's a time when there were a lot of North Koreans operating in this region. And also around the January period, you had North Koreans recorded operating around Kruglenkoy, Novo Ivanovka, Zeleny Shlach, this entire region. They were involved in a lot of the advances that occurred in between populated areas like Olgovka and Kremyanoy to push eastwards a couple of kilometers through open fields and through areas that have a lot of tree lines to reach the spine of Ukraine's defensive network in Kursk that I'm circling over here, that spans from Pogrebki all the way to Nikolsky. So they were involved in just pushing the mantle a bit further east, and did it through really strenuous conditions because they were advancing largely through open fields and only had the concealment of tree lines and foliage. And that was during the winter when a lot of the leaves were falling, and some of the tree lines weren't even as dense. So they had a very difficult operation handed to them during that time period, and they fought during a time when also the advances recorded by the Russian side were actually rather minimal, and the casualties were high in comparison. But that dirty work that was done by the North Koreans, and also for the most part in this area, was not done by North Koreans. For the most part, there were Russian units like the ones that I'm clicking on over here from the VDV or from Marine regiments or territorial motor rifle regiments that were created over the past 2 years. They were the units that mainly conducted the attacks over here, even during January, December of 2024 or 25. But they were accompanied by some North Korean elements during the initial assaults, and they played a role in overrunning some Ukrainian positions that eventually sort of led to the buildup that helped the Russians secure the breakthrough in March. And that breakthrough was largely paved and capitalized upon by Russian soldiers, not North Koreans, because North Koreans had sort of been removed for operational pause during that time period. But they were involved in a lot of heavy intensity fighting a couple of months ago. And so that's why Gerasimov gave that sort of acknowledgement. Now, looking at the Belgorod region, you can see that the Russians, at the very least, have taken back Popovka, and at most have pushed the Ukrainians out of almost all of the Belgorod region. So we have a geolocation from April 26th of Russian forces walking through the northwestern chunk of this village. It's no longer under Ukrainian control. And in Demidovka, there's no record of Ukrainians from recent days. Russian sources are claiming that the front line looks something like this, wherein nearly the entirety of the Ukrainian sort of adventure into Belgorod has been reclaimed, but that there is an exception with these border regions where there are some forced areas as well. I'm going to be a bit more conservative with my estimates of the Russian advances and say that there is still a Ukrainian presence. It's not particularly large or organized, but there are still Ukrainian squads operating in this forested area in particular. The Russians need to work on clearing out right now, and they're sort of situated near the Udava River. And the units, as we all know by now, are the 33rd Assault Regiment, 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, 225th Assault Regiment, 47th Mechanized Brigade, and then there's also drone support from the Pentagon drone units. You could see that the Ukrainians at most control 9 square kilometers of territory, although I'd say that it's sort of like a flimsy control. It's just sort of like the Ukrainians now are reducing their presence in these areas, and it's not anything organized at this point. The Russians will now look to exploit their capture of Popovka to fully push the Ukrainians out. And then the question is, what will the Ukrainians decide to do with their garrisons that are currently defending in Sumy? Will they decide to maintain their presence over here in order to prevent deeper Russian infiltrations 10 kilometers into Sumy? Or rather, will they be deployed, at least some of them, to other parts of the front line where they may be of use around the Donetsk, for instance, around the Kalinova region where the Russians are currently breaking through? That is something that I find to be rather interesting because it appears to me, based on the Russian maintenance of pretty much the same amount of troops operating in Kursk and Sumy over the past couple of months, even after the breakthrough that occurred in March, they've not really moved that many forces away to other parts of the front line. It indicates that the Russians are preparing now for a new round of attacks that will include fighting in the Sumy region with, pretty notable goals, not necessarily extremely deep, but definitely to capture some of these border villages over here. And then the question will be whether the Ukrainians will fully maintain the size of their garrison over here to prevent the Russians from maximizing their gains, or will they look at other parts of the front line that definitely need the reinforcements right now? That's something that we could only know in the future. But I want to zoom in on the Donetsk region. There are a couple of updates that I find to be of importance. So over here in the Dnipro region, this is an area that I've covered extensively, and I've also sort of had a bit of foresight to say that the Russians are probably going to launch assaults along this direction, and how it's happened. So you can see that the Russians advance south of Uspanivka and to the southeast of Novoalexandrivka. They captured 0.7 square kilometers of territory. In terms of a horizontal advance, they pushed about 1.3 kilometers westwards. And here's the geolocation. You had Russian armored vehicles. They advanced. They also conducted suppressive fire towards the Ukrainian controlled tree lines. And at the same time, they targeted the Ukrainian rear, so Ukrainian forces could not muster up a grouping to conduct a counterattack. So there were a couple of Ukrainian vehicles, maybe I think it was like 4 vehicles that were targeted by FPV drones during the recording of the video. Perhaps they were located around here or here, but they were stopped before they could actually engage the advancing Russian forces. And this is a part of, again, something that I've noted, the Russians trying to open up a southern flank through which to apply pressure onto the grueling battle in Uspanivka, and then also to expand their horizons to Novoalexandrivka, and more generally the chain of villages running along the Solona River. That's one thing. Then in Avdiivka, the Russian forces were able to fully push out the Ukrainian remnants that were holding out over here, and they held out despite, a really high intensity Russian bombardment regimen, and also just a lot of constant assaults on a daily basis. So the Ukrainian garrison over here, which was pretty small, but I believe it was from the 59th Brigade and perhaps also the 11th National Guard Brigade, they were able to hold in a sort of steadfast manner for a long period of time. But now they've fully lost control over the hangars to the northwest of the village, and also whatever residential areas and trenches that had left. The Russians in the process took back zero point 0.8 square kilometers of territory. This is from April 26th. The 59th Brigade conducted 7 FPV strikes onto these advancing Russian forces. They were advancing on motorcycles through open areas, trying to seize the environs of the town, and they were struck during that process. There were also Russian soldiers mounted on pickup trucks that were struck by Ukrainian FPVs, and then also just individual soldiers that were walking along tree lines or adjacent to open fields, and they were targeted as well. That was all recorded. But this also means that the Russian forces have been able to take out a major outlet of Ukrainian resistance in this region, and also thereby were able to deny the Ukrainians access to these trenches that you see built north of Avdiivka, meaning that the Russians will now have a lot more operational flexibility to advance basically north of this village and through these open fields towards the Solona River if they so choose, or westwards towards the border with Dnipro, which is heavily fortified by now. Let's look at the distances. To reach the Novosibirsk region, it's about 5 kilometers, and it's just exclusively open fields. And then to reach Dnipro from there, it's like 8 kilometers. But when you look at the nearest available spot to reach the border, it's only about 3 kilometers. Last thing that I want to look at today is in advance of pretty large proportions, and it's just to the southwest of Rozliv. So over here, the Russians captured 7.2 square kilometers of territory. We have this video from April 26th, and there's a new tactical group that I've seen recently on Facebook by the name of Vuhledar. So, we all know everything that occurred in Vuhledar and how far away it is from the front line right now. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians insist on calling it tactical group Vuhledar. So they say that they spotted a Russian assault column organizing around 4 a.m. today. They claim that in the assault, there were 18 motorcycles involved, of which 15 were destroyed. 9 vehicles were damaged or destroyed out of the 10 that were involved. And then the Russians incurred 40 casualties. So that would be killed and injured. And we can't really see those casualties in the video. It's more so confirmation of some of the vehicles getting damaged or destroyed, which definitely did happen based on the videos that we see. We saw in the footage the utilization of FPV strikes to target Russian soldiers that were advancing through open areas and tree lines. We also saw grenade drops onto those troops and DPICM cluster munition shelling of the motorcycles as Russian troops were withdrawing or dismounting from them. So it appears that the attack basically occurred like this. They were pushing northwards over here with motorcycles in just sizable amounts at the same time, then dismounted along some of these sort of forested areas, hedgerows, and that's when they were targeted by the Ukrainian side. And this means that the Russians were unable to reach the town of Bakhatir, but in the process, they were able to overrun this line of anti-tank ditches and trenches. And nonetheless, they achieved a sizable advance of around 2.2 kilometers. As a result, the Russians are now only about 2.5 kilometers south of Bakhatir. And I mentioned this. I said that this was just going to become the situation eventually because the Russians, they understood that the cost of assaulting Oleksivka and Bakhatir frontally was really not worth it when there's a much easier and much more untapped route south of the town that could be utilized based on the road network located over here and just the open fields presenting an opportunity for armored forces to assault and advance across a pretty large swath of territory in a short period of time. So that's what we're seeing manifest right now, and I'll keep an eye out for that part of the front line. Thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next upload. Goodbye.